A single German aircraft, in a matter of weeks, destroyed what the British had paid for in blood over a full year, and the official reports were ordered to stay silent about it. They called it the Flying Butcher. Seasoned pilots clenched their teeth at the sight of its silhouette. The green ones simply lost their heads. And the command of one of the strongest aviation powers on the planet secretly classified the truth about it, because to admit that truth out loud was impossible. But here is the question that still sends a chill down historians' spines. If this machine was so perfect, why did it lose? What broke? And who truly paid the price? At the center of this story is a man whose surname sounded like a verdict, and one decision of his that colleagues called pure madness. We will take this machine apart down to the last bolt, from the classified archives to the sky over two fronts, where one and the same aircraft wrote two utterly different stories. Watch to the end. We begin. When it appeared in the sky, seasoned pilots clenched their jaws and the green ones lost their heads to fear. It was the Focke-Wulf 190, a German fighter that, in a matter of weeks, wiped out the entire air superiority of the British, the very superiority that had been won over a full year, the hard way, through losses, through gritted teeth. A machine the enemy nicknamed the Flying Butcher. And believe me, that nickname was not an exaggeration by a single ounce. Picture the scene for a moment. The finest air force of one of the world's strongest powers, and suddenly it stands helpless. A year of work, a year of sacrifice, a year of hard-earned command of the sky, and all of it swept aside by one new machine in a handful of weeks. How was that even possible? What had to happen for the sky to change hands so fast? If the aircraft was so perfect, then why, in the end, did it lose? What went wrong? And who is to blame? The designer himself, the system that built the planes, the shortage of resources? Or is there perhaps something that has still never been said out loud? Today, we run a full breakdown, with no gloss and no convenient silences. We will pry open the technical secrets kept in the shadows for so long, and the decisions that ended up costing a monstrous price. And at the very center of this story stands a man whose surname, you will not believe it, literally reflected what he did his entire life. Watch to the end. The finale will surprise you, I guarantee it. So, meet him, Kurt Tank. And it is with him that this story starts. His surname sounded like a verdict. Tank. Kurt Tank. Many people are still convinced it was a stage name, a flashy invention, a nickname coined for effect. Nothing of the sort. It was his real German surname, given to him at birth, and in a certain sense it turned out to be prophetic to the point of indecency. Kurt Tank came into the world in the year 1898 in the town of Bromberg, today the Polish city of Bydgoszcz. He earned an engineering education, and aviation very quickly took him whole, leaving nothing behind. In 1931, he joined the Focke-Wulf company as technical director. He was 33, an age at which some are still searching for themselves, while others are already dictating the rules to an entire industry. Tank did not merely draw. He climbed into the cockpit himself and took his own machines into the air. Picture an architect who personally spends the night in every house he designs, in winter, with no heating, to feel with his own skin where the draft creeps in. That was Kurt Tank, a man who would not trust paper with anything the body could verify. By 1937, what stood behind him were no longer sketches, but serious, menacing machines. The long-range maritime patrol aircraft Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, a four-engine giant that became an outright nightmare for the Allied merchant fleet in the Atlantic. That aircraft sank ships and spread such terror among the convoys that a British Prime Minister would later call it the scourge of the Atlantic. And beside it, the reconnaissance plane Focke-Wulf 189, a machine with a distinctive twin-boom silhouette that Soviet troops on the ground remembered well and for a long time. They called it the frame, and the appearance of the frame in the sky too often meant that trouble was about to fall. By the time the competition was announced, Tank was no dreamer with burning eyes and a stack of brilliant ideas. He was a mature engineer with a heavy, proven record. His machines were already flying, already fighting, already costing the enemy blood and nerves. Arguing with a biography like that was hard. And so, in 1937, the command of the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of Germany, announced a competition for an entirely new fighter. The reason was more than serious: the Spanish sky. It was there, in the battles over Spain, that German pilots first ran up close against the Soviet Polikarpov I-16 fighters. The result of that encounter did not satisfy the command in the slightest. It became clear: the age of the old machines was ending. A new generation of fighter was needed, and it was needed yesterday. The requirements were written down hard and without sentiment. Survivability, but with no loss of speed or maneuverability. Reliability in combat. Simple servicing right in the field, on the ground, in a mechanic's dirty hands. And as a separate, almost mocking clause, the ability to operate from poorly prepared dirt airfields. That clause was a direct, undisguised jab at the Messerschmitt 109, whose takeoff and landing on soaked ground turned into a lottery. Competing with the Messerschmitt firm was an almost hopeless undertaking. They had everything the others lacked: the right connections in high offices, a spotless, polished reputation, and above all, a finished, already adopted serial fighter that actually flew and actually fought. Against that backdrop, Focke-Wulf looked like a clear outsider in this contest, a dark horse few would have placed serious money on. And it is right here that the part of the story begins which the prim technical reference books step around. Kurt Tank could do more than build aircraft and lift them into the sky. He knew how to talk to the right people at the right moment. He knew how to present an achievement with flair and how to tactfully steer around a weak point. In the corridors of the German aviation ministry, he found his way almost as confidently as in the cockpit of his own fighter. A large state contract is not only the best drawings and the most honest figures, it is also connections. It is the knack of being in the right office at the right time and saying exactly the words they want to hear there. Tank pushed his project forward, not with calculations on drafting paper alone. He pushed it with convincing arguments that struck home and found a lively response among the people who made the decisions. And in the end, the contract for a new fighter went to Focke-Wulf. Then came the hardest part. The contract was won, which meant it had to be justified. He had to prove the bet had not been placed in vain, that the outsider was capable of outplaying the favorite. And the very first serious decision Tank made was met by his own colleagues with open hostility. They considered that decision an outright gamble, almost professional self-destruction in front of the entire industry. For his fighter, Tank chose a type of engine that aviation circles of the late 30s regarded as bulky, heavy, and hopelessly outdated. People snickered at such a choice. It looked like a step backward in an era that was tearing only forward. And it was precisely this decision that, in the end, made the Focke-Wulf 190 what it became. But before it bore fruit, it nearly buried the entire project whole, with all its drawings and hopes. The choice of engine in aviation is never only about technology. It is politics. It is vast sums of money. It is waiting lists at the factories and signatures in high offices. To err here meant not merely getting a poor aircraft. To err meant being left with no aircraft at all, because the needed engine might physically not be available at the needed moment. To grasp the full scale of this gamble, one has to understand a simple thing. There are two fundamentally different ways to cool an aircraft engine, and between them, in those years, ran a genuine front line, engineering, industrial, almost ideological. The first way is liquid cooling. Inside the engine, a coolant circulates, exactly as under the hood of an ordinary passenger car. Such an engine comes out compact, narrow, drawn out in length. It is easy to tuck into a sharp, streamlined nose. The aerodynamics are beyond all praise. It was precisely such engines that sat in the Messerschmitt 109, and it was precisely such engines that the entire German aviation industry catastrophically lacked. The second way is air cooling. Here there is neither liquid nor radiators. The cylinders of the engine are pushed outward and bathed by the oncoming airflow right in flight. The engine comes out round, wide, sprawling, resembling an enormous star, hence the name, the radial engine. It is larger, it is thicker, it creates far greater frontal drag and slows the aircraft by the very fact of its existence. By the measures of the late 30s, a choice in favor of the star looked like an archaism, a museum piece. The thinking ran like this: want a fast, elegant, modern fighter, fit a liquid engine and hide it in a narrow nose. Want a wide, blunt iron that breaks itself. Take the star. The logic seemed ironclad. To argue against it meant going against the entire fashion of the age. And against that backdrop, under the skeptical smirks of his colleagues and under the whole industry's certainty that a modern fighter is built only around a liquid engine, Kurt Tank made his choice. He chose precisely that one, the bulky, wide, outdated radial engine of air cooling. And he had a solid reason. A reason that was simple, ironclad, and not open to discussion. The two main producers of liquid-cooled engines in Germany, the Daimler-Benz and Junkers firms, were, by 1939, working at the very limit of their capacity. They were choking. Waiting lists for their output stretched months ahead, and in those lists there was no free slot for a new, as yet unknown outsider of a fighter. Daimler-Benz barely coped with supplying engines for the Messerschmitt 109 and the heavy twin-engine Messerschmitt 110. Any additional orders were either cut to token figures or cancelled outright, with no explanation. Junkers' Jumo 211 engines were devoured in monstrous quantities by the bombers. The Dornier Do 17, the Junkers Ju 87, and the Junkers Ju 88. There too stood a dead-end queue. Put plainly, a good liquid-cooled engine for a new fighter simply did not exist in free supply anywhere in the country. Tank grasped this arithmetic of shortage earlier than the others and played on what was actually available here and now. The Bavarian Motor Works, in German Bayerische Motorenwerke, known to the whole world by 3 short letters, offered their radial engine. At first, this was the model BMW 139 with a power of 1,550 horsepower. Take that figure in and compare. The Junkers Jumo 210D engine, fitted to the early versions of the Messerschmitt 109, put out a mere 635 horsepower. The difference, more than twofold. While the whole industry laughed at the outdated Star, that Star delivered twice the power of the main rival's serial engine. So much for the step backward. So much for the museum piece. But the radial engine had its own signature, agonizing disease. On the ground and at takeoff it overheated because the oncoming airflow was not yet enough. And at high altitude and speed it did the opposite. It overcooled because the icy stream blew right through it. This wild temperature swing mercilessly destroyed the engine's parts from the inside. The way out they found was unconventional. They placed an extra fan right in front of the engine. At the start of flight, on takeoff, it forcibly boosted the airflow and kept the engine from boiling over. After climbing, the logic reversed. The fan began to work differently and shielded the engine from icy overcooling. An elegant solution on paper, but full, reliable refinement of that system was still very, very far away. And while the engineers were taming the temperamental cooling system, the pilots running the first prototypes ran into a frankly unpleasant surprise. The heat from the engine broke straight into the cockpit. The temperature there climbed to 50 degrees Celsius. Picture it. 50 degrees is the same as sitting in a well-heated bathhouse, but in full flight gear at an altitude of several thousand meters, while also piloting a combat machine. That problem was subdued slowly and with great difficulty. But even the scorching cockpit did not become the project's main shock. The main thing lay ahead. At a certain point, the Bavarian Motor Works came to tank with a new proposal that turned everything over. They had brought to readiness a fundamentally different engine, the BMW 801. It was more powerful, it was more promising, but it was noticeably heavier and longer than its predecessor. The new engine proved so much larger that the engine mount had to be entirely redone, and the pilot's cockpit shifted back by 300 millimeters. In effect, this was already an entirely different aircraft, a new project requiring an almost complete reworking of finished drawings. Tank agreed without hesitation. The logic was ironclad. If the engine is better, then the aircraft in the end will be better too. Everything else is secondary. In the summer of 1938, the reworked draft project was approved at the top. The Focke-Wulf company received an order for 4 experimental prototypes, and the first of them, with the factory designation V1, lifted into the air on the 1st of June, 1939. At the controls sat not a hired test pilot, but Kurt Tank himself, in person. The machine showed excellent handling from the very first flight. Minor flaws were caught and ironed out quickly, with no drawn-out fuss. Serial production of the Focke-Wulf 190A modification began in 1941. The machine was ready for a great war. Only one thing remained to be found out: whether the world was ready for this machine. Picture yourself buying a car. The first option, fast, powerful, predatory in looks, but with a narrow track, temperamental on a bad road, and parking it without a scratch, is an art in itself. The second, a touch less elegant on the outside, but wide, stable, forgiving of mistakes, and starting in any frost. That, roughly, was how the choice between the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 looked to any technician who had seen both machines from the inside. Let us begin literally from the ground. The Messerschmitt 109 had a narrow landing gear track. The struts retracted outward, toward the wingtips, and on the rollout the machine yawed, trying to swing across the strip. On smooth concrete they managed it. But on a dirt strip soaked after rain, it turned into an outright disaster. The accident statistics on takeoff and landing for the 109 spoke more eloquently than any words. Tank solved this question at the very root. The landing gear struts of the Focke-Wulf 190 retracted inward toward the fuselage, toward the center of the aircraft. The track came out wide, spread, genuinely stable. The machine stood on the ground confidently, brazenly, like a boxer in the right stance. And a young pilot with little flight time could set it down on a dirt strip with no dramatic consequences and no gray hairs. But when it concerns an aircraft built by the thousand and handed to pilots of the most varied levels, it ceases to be a trifle. It is machines saved on the rollout. It is pilots saved, not smashed up over nothing. It is dozens and hundreds of combat sorties that took place instead of ending in a breakdown at the start. Now let us raise our eyes higher, to the cockpit canopy. In the 30s and the early 40s, many fighters carried canopies with thick metal frames. The view from such a cockpit was pitiful. The pilot looked out at a deadly sky literally through a grill, through a lattice of struts. And in air combat, where fractions of a second decide everything and where the enemy can surface from any direction, such a view is an outright sentence. On the Focke-Wulf 190, they fitted a large teardrop canopy with a minimum of metal framing. The view from the cockpit became exceptional by the standards of the time. The pilot saw almost the entire space around him, behind, to the side, above. Later, it was precisely this kind of canopy that became the world standard for the new generation of fighters. Everyone copied it. But the first to truly apply it was this very German. He thought not about a pretty picture in an advertising brochure, but about the living man in the cockpit, about that man seeing the enemy first. And whoever sees first most often strikes first. Now about the protection of that man. The designers hung 110 kilograms of armor on the machine and distributed it with cold calculation. A 14mm armored headrest covered the pilot's head from behind. An 8mm armored backrest and armored seat held the body. 8mm plates shielded the pilot from the sides. A 5mm armored ring protected the front part of the engine cowling. But even that was not all. Additionally, they armored the lower cowling panels, the lower surfaces of the wing's center section, and the lower part of the fuselage right under the fuel tanks. Such armor did not make the aircraft invulnerable. Miracles do not happen. But against a standard rifle bullet of 7.62mm caliber, or against a fragment of an anti-aircraft shell, it held. And that meant it gave the pilot the main thing: one extra chance to return to the airfield alive. An aircraft with no armor is downed by a single lucky burst. An aircraft with 110 kilograms of steel around the pilot snarls back, crawls home to its own side, and goes into battle again tomorrow. Every extra gram of weight here paid off in an extra day of life for a trained, expensive specialist. And now, the weapons. And it is right here that the most interesting part begins. On the early serial machines, 2 synchronized machine guns of 7.92mm caliber of the Mauser MG-17 make sat in the cowling above the engine. Later they were replaced by far nastier 13mm Mauser MG-131 guns. And in the wing a real battery was lined up. 4 cannons of 20mm caliber. 2 closer to the fuselage of the Mauser MG-151 make, 2 farther toward the wingtips of the Mauser Mk-108 make. On the later modifications, the Focke-Wulf 190 D9 and D12, the total mass of metal thrown out by the weapons reached 350 kilograms per minute. The figure sounds abstract until there is something to compare it with. So let us compare, and the comparison comes out merciless. The famous Soviet ground attack aircraft, Ilyushin YL-2, armed with 2 VYA-23 cannons and 2 SHKAS machine guns, posted 265 kilograms per minute. The Lavochkin La-5 fighter, only 105 kilograms. The British Supermarine Spitfire of the 9th model, 202 kilograms. The American Bell P-39 era Cobra, with its large 30mm cannon and 2 machine guns, 160 kilograms. Take in that gap, 350 kilograms against 200, against 160, against 105. The German machine spat more metal at the enemy than the heavy, specially built armored IL-2 ground attack plane. An air superiority fighter hit harder than the flying tank of the battlefield. A single proper burst of such a salvo was enough to break an enemy aircraft to pieces in the air. The Focke-Wulf pilot could himself choose exactly what to open fire from. The weapons control system allowed any combination to be switched on: machine guns only, cannons only, machine guns together with 2 cannons of choice, all 4 cannons at once, or simply everything together in one incinerating salvo. A few toggles within reach, and done. The pilot dosed out his fury however he liked. And now, the most incredible thing for the year 1941. Picture the workplace of a fighter pilot of those years. During takeoff and climb, he simultaneously moved the throttle lever, switched the supercharger gear, manually adjusted the propeller pitch, watched the ignition timing, monitored the oil pressure. A dozen operations at the most strained moment, when the machine had not yet gained saving speed and any mistake is fatal. And what was the German pilot in the cockpit of the Focke-Wulf 190 doing at that moment? He made one single movement. He moved one engine control lever. Everything else was taken over by the automation. It set the needed supercharger mode itself. It regulated the fuel supply itself. It chose the optimal ignition timing itself. It set the correct propeller pitch itself. The year 1941. On a serial, mass-produced fighter, an electromechanical computer worked, taking a dozen routine operations off the man. In the enemy's cockpits, pilots were still juggling levers with both hands, risking a spin on takeoff. And in the Focke-Wulf cockpit, the pilot's head was free for one single task, and that task was simple and terrible. Freed from the technical routine, rid of a dozen distracting movements, the German pilot did exactly one thing. He searched for the enemy in his sight. On the 27th of September, 1941, the most ordinary autumn day hung over the English Channel. A gray sky, low cloud, cold, damp air. British pilots in Supermarine Spitfire fighters of the 5th model were patrolling a familiar route they had flown 100 times. Routine, boredom, nothing foretold trouble. And then two unfamiliar aircraft appeared on the horizon. The British peered closer. The shape was strange, unusual, a round, blunt nose, a wide cowling, a squat silhouette. It resembled nothing German they had seen before that day. The pilot's brain searched its memory for a familiar image and found the wrong one. The pilots of the Royal Air Force identified the strangers as captured American Curtiss Hawk 75 fighters. The logic was even reasonable. Such machines sometimes fell into German hands through seized French airfields, and the round nose did seem to match. It was a mistake, an expensive, very expensive mistake. Before them were not American trophies. Before them were Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. The first combat outing of the newest German machine over the Western Front ended with no losses at all on either side. The Germans were on reconnaissance, did not pick a fight, and calmly departed. But the British pilots firmly memorized that unfamiliar silhouette, and very soon encounters with it became far more frequent than anyone in London would have liked. Within a few weeks, the picture began to clear, and it was frankly grim. By the autumn of 1941, the Spitfire of the 5th model was considered the best serial fighter of the Royal Air Force. This was the very machine on which the British, a year earlier in 1940, had stood firm in the Battle of Britain, in the hardest battles over their own cities. A symbol machine, a machine the pilots trusted as they trusted themselves. And now this celebrated machine had suddenly begun to lose. The figures were merciless. The Focke-Wulf 190 outpaced the 5th model Spitfire in speed by roughly 30 kilometers per hour. It accelerated faster in a dive. It had a higher rate of climb. That is, it gained altitude noticeably more briskly. It entered a turn with greater initial speed. By every key parameter of combat, the German was simply ahead. If a Spitfire pilot did manage to get onto the German's tail, the German did not panic and did not twist about. He simply went down. He dropped into a shallow dive at a slight angle and accelerated to speeds at which any pursuit lost all meaning. Soviet pilots would later record exactly the same thing. In a shallow dive at an angle of about 30 degrees, the Focke-Wulf accelerated to 1,045 kilometers per hour. Try and catch that. This superiority had an engineering basis too. The smaller wing area of the Focke-Wulf compared to the Spitfire was more than offset by the higher lifting properties of its thick wing profile. In practice, this meant a simple and frightening thing. The German machine held confidently in the air where another fighter with such a small wing was already breaking into an uncontrollable spin. The Focke-Wulf 190 had one weak spot in this confrontation. At high altitudes, above 6,000 meters, its BMW 801 engine began to lose power noticeably. Up there, in the thin heights, the 5th model Spitfire once again felt confident and on equal footing. But the whole trouble was that the overwhelming majority of clashes over the Channel took place at medium and low altitudes, and there the German was the sole master of the sky. For this masterful manner, the British pilots awarded their new enemy a short, vicious nickname, the Flying Butcher. Short, no extra words, no respectful bows. A nickname in which one heard not admiration, but cold fear of what this machine did to pilots in the air. The command of the Royal Air Force found itself in an extremely awkward, almost shameful position. Just a year earlier, in the Battle of Britain, at the cost of immense effort and immense losses, superiority over the Messerschmitt 109 of models E and F had been won. That superiority was paid for with months of the harshest fighting and a multitude of young lives cut short. And now, in just a few weeks, all of it had been crossed out at a stroke by a single new German aircraft. The real state of affairs was simply classified. Information about the true capabilities of the new enemy was sealed off. As a result, pilots in frontline units kept taking losses, meeting in the sky an enemy about whom they were told nothing concrete. The command physically did not want to admit aloud the obvious. The Luftwaffe had a machine the 5th model Spitfire could not contend with on equal terms. A simple question begged itself. Why not just capture one such aircraft intact and take it apart bolt by bolt? That is precisely what the British were trying to do, and fate handed them a gift, in the most unexpected, almost farcical manner. On the 23rd of June, 1942, a German pilot by the name of Armin Faber committed the crudest of navigational errors. After a hard air battle over southwestern England, having lost his bearings, he mistook the Bristol Channel for the English Channel, and he landed. He landed confidently, as if at home, at the British military airfield of Pembrey in Wales, alive and unhurt. In an absolutely intact, serviceable Focke-Wulf 190A3. British intelligence could not have begged for a better gift. The enemy himself, with his own hands, had delivered them the secret machine on a silver platter. The British specialists pounced on the trophy at once. They flew the aircraft inside and out, took it apart down to the last assembly, studied every bolt. The resulting report came out grim to the point of despair. The machine turned out to be exactly as the pilots had described it in their panicked combat reports. Not a gram of exaggeration, not a single tall tale. All of it, the plain, unpleasant truth. Exactly one way out remained. Either urgently build a new fighter from scratch, or just as urgently bring the existing one to readiness. And in July of 1942, almost exactly a year after the first appearance of the Focke-Wulf 190 over the Channel, the Spitfire of the 9th model began reaching Royal Air Force units. Only with its arrival did the balance of power in the sky finally even out. Take in that date once more, almost a whole year. A whole year was needed by one of the strongest aviation powers on the planet, with all its science, industry, and combat traditions, merely to find a worthy answer to one single new enemy aircraft. Two fronts, one aircraft, two utterly different stories. While over the English Channel, the Focke-Wulf 190 was methodically, coldly crossing out everything the Royal Air Force had achieved over the previous year. In the east, an entirely different picture was unfolding. The same machine, the same engine, the same specifications on paper. But the sky over the Soviet Union lived by its own particular laws, and those laws turned out to be less kind to the German marvel. The first Focke-Wulf 190 fighters appeared on the Eastern Front in 1942. The machines began reaching the fighter units battling against the Soviet Air Force, the one that in those years was officially called the Air Forces of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. And here begins a paradox that to this day confounds everyone who first takes the history of this machine seriously. Ask any Soviet pilot who went through that war whom he feared most in the German sky. Ask, and you will hear an answer that repeats again and again, in memoirs, in combat reports, in sparse post-war interviews. The Messerschmitt, not the Focke-Wulf, not the flying butcher whose silhouette alone chilled the British, but precisely the Messerschmitt 109. How is that even possible? A machine that in a matter of weeks broke the spine of British fighter aviation did not become even the chief nightmare of the enemy on another front. The same aircraft, the same figures, the same firepower, and an utterly different reputation. The answer does not lie in the airframe's design. The answer sits in the cockpit. The answer is in the people who held the control stick. When the Focke-Wulf 190 first appeared and bared its teeth over Western Europe, the command of the Luftwaffe made a decision with a long, heavy echo. The best, most experienced pilots, who had already mastered the temperamental new machine, were kept in the West. There sat the main political and strategic enemy, Britain, and soon the strengthening American units as well. There, to the West, they threw their aces. There results were needed at any price, and there it was the aces who delivered them. And to the East, the Focke-Wulf 190 came with entirely different people, with young ones, with those who had far fewer flight hours behind them and far less real combat experience. And here lies the first half of the answer. Even under the watch of good instructors, a cadet of yesterday simply could not, physically, wring out of this machine its whole colossal potential, and the potential was enormous, monstrous, almost inexhaustible. Recall that very dive. In a shallow dive, at an angle of about 30 degrees, the Focke-Wulf 190 accelerated to speeds at which pursuit became pointless. Soviet pilots fully confirmed this in their reports. The Germans often slipped out from under a blow precisely that way. They dropped down, toward the very ground if the altitude allowed, and dissolved. The machine could do this brilliantly. But the skill of the machine and the skill of the pilot are, as we know, two very different things. While the Focke-Wulf 190 was unhurriedly working its way towards serial production and saturating the combat units, the Soviet aviation industry was by no means standing still. It was tearing forward, evacuated beyond the Urals, working in 3 shifts, and it managed to give birth to a whole generation of new machines exactly at the needed moment. By the time of the Focke-Wulf 190's mass appearance on the Eastern Front, the Lavochkin La-5 was already entering service, a fighter the pilots at first received warily, with distrust, but which very quickly won their sincere respect in battle. Following it came the even more formidable Lavochkin La-7 and the Lend-Lease machines, American and British fighters that the Allies supplied to the Soviet Union. By their flight characteristics, these aircraft had already drawn right up to the Focke-Wulf, and in certain regimes and altitudes frankly surpassed it. The Eastern Front had one more peculiarity, spoken of unforgivably seldom. The very character of the clashes here differed strikingly from the Western theater. Vast distances, a monstrous length of front line, and above all, the actions of aviation were nailed firmly to the support of ground troops, to working over the front edge, over the trenches, over the columns of tanks. The fighting here most often took place at low and medium altitudes, there, where the difference in flight data between the machines was far less obvious than in a one-on-one duel in the clear sky over the Channel. High-altitude advantages and disadvantages were simply erased here. In the tight, nervous dogfight just above the ground, what decided everything was no longer the aircraft's data sheet, but the hands and head of the one who flew it. And the Soviet pilots worked out against the Focke-Wulf 190 their own cold, calculated tactics. Rule 1. Do not climb into a head-on attack and a speed duel where the German is knowingly stronger. Rule 2. By every means impose on him a maneuvering fight at low altitudes, in steep turns, where his advantage in speed turned into a burden. Rule 3. Work in coordinated pairs and groups, giving the enemy not a second to accelerate and bring his main trump card into play. This was not cowardice. This was not weakness. This was cold professional mastery. To soberly know the enemy's strong sides and not expose oneself to them, imposing battle on one's own terms. And in this competent, calculated approach lay the answer to the Eastern paradox. One detail is telling, small but eloquent. On the Eastern Front, in the Soviet milieu, the German air-cooled fighter acquired its own, separate nickname, Focke, short, familiar, almost matey. In that nickname there was none of the superstitious dread that rang in the British flying butcher. Focke is an enemy one respects, but one whom they had learned to beat. But in the unofficial talk between sorties, in the sparse lines of combat reports, and in the detailed breakdowns of air clashes, the chief threat that surfaced time and again was precisely the Messerschmitt. It was the one named as the enemy to be feared first of all, and the Focke-Wulf 190, for all its outstanding data sheet characteristics, never became on the Eastern Front the merciless master of the sky that it had been on the Western. And the reason was not at all that the aircraft had suddenly become bad. The reason was something else, far deeper. A magnificent machine is only half the equation of victory, the cold, merciless equation that war solves every single day. The second half of that equation is the man in the cockpit. There is a question that, in arguments about the aviation of the Second World War, it is customary to step around. It is uncomfortable. It destroys the neat tables of comparative characteristics and the pretty graphs of speeds. It demolishes the whole cozy logic by which the machine with the bigger figures on its data sheet is the one that ought to win. But without this question, the entire picture remains incomplete and, frankly, false. What matters more in air combat, the flying machine or the man who controls it? It sounds like a naive question from a school textbook. In practice, it was a question on whose answer it directly depended whether the pilot returned to the airfield or not. Let us set up a hard, almost laboratory experiment. Let us take a concrete, utterly clear situation and see what history itself has to say. In one cockpit, a seasoned ace, 1,000 flight hours behind him, 2 years of unbroken combat service, hundreds of sorties. But his machine is outdated, of yesterday. In the other cockpit, a green novice with minimal flight time, barely graduated from flying school. Yet his machine is the very newest, with outstanding characteristics, surpassing the old fighter in every respect. The trick question, which of these two will gain the upper hand? The history of aviation gives this question an answer utterly unambiguous and utterly merciless. Most often the experienced pilot will win. He will win in his old machine, the one inferior on the numbers, because he knows exactly what must be done in those 2 or 3 seconds that decide the outcome of the whole fight. He does not deliberate. He does not weigh options. His hands act on their own before consciousness manages to shape the decision into a thought. That, precisely, is combat experience, not a line in a personnel file, but a reflex hammered firmly into the body. This is exactly what happened to the Focke-Wulf 190 on the Eastern Front. The machine was capable of a great deal. It could tear away from pursuit in a shallow dive. It could impose a fight at a speed favorable to itself. It could deliver one precise incinerating blow in the very first attack and dissolve into the sky before the enemy managed to react and turn. But all of this, absolutely all of it, demanded one thing from the man in the cockpit: mastery, a precise, instinct-level sense of the moment. The ability to assess, in a fraction of a second, the whole shifting situation in the air, the skill to wring from the machine the one single movement needed right now, and not a second later. A young pilot with thin combat experience simply could not do all this, and not because he was a bad man or a lazy cadet, but because such things are not taught from textbooks and manuals. They are worked out in the real sky, under real fire, over years. Some had those years. Some no longer had them to spare. And here we come right up against that very decision the Luftwaffe made at the outset, and which echoed dully back to them until the very end. When the Focke-Wulf 190 appeared and thundered over the Western Front, the command kept the best pilots precisely there. The logic, I repeat, was in its own way ironclad. The Western direction was considered the priority, the showcase, the politically important one. Britain, and then the American units rolling in wave upon wave. There a result was demanded that could be shown off, and the East got what was left. Not the worst men, no, but the less experienced, the less battle-tested. And it was precisely this difference in human experience that in the end outweighed all the difference in the aircraft's characteristics. Steel and engines proved lighter than the hours a man had spent in battle. Here are the dry figures to grasp the chasm. The best Luftwaffe pilots on the western direction had combat flight time measured in hundreds of hours of real, not training, air clashes, while the young pilots arriving at units in the east by the middle of that great war often had a total flight time 2 or even 3 times less. It was a chasm, and into that chasm fell the entire brilliant potential of the German machine. Sooner or later, every side of the conflict ran into this problem. The longer the confrontation dragged on, the more mercilessly it knocked experienced, battle-tested pilots out of the ranks, replacing them with cadets of yesterday. But among the Germans, this ulcer opened earlier and ached more sharply. The reason is simple. 2 fronts at once means exactly twice as fast a burn-through of precious, irreplaceable, experienced cadres. An experienced pilot cannot be stamped out at a factory in a single shift, the way a new cowling or gun barrel is cast. He is made by years, by sorties, by scars, and by luck. And such pilots were being knocked out of the ranks in a few minutes of battle. Industry could still somehow make good the losses in metal, pressing out new airframes. But the losses in men, in their mastery never written down on paper, no warring side could replace in time. And now, that very uncomfortable fact promised at the very beginning. Imagine that you are a designer. You have created an outstanding machine. A machine that, on bare characteristics, surpasses everything the enemy has. A machine on which even an ordinary, average pilot is bound to show an above-average result. And here is the crux. That is precisely what was the chief, original goal of Kurt Tank. Recall the requirements of that long-ago competition of 1937. Simplicity in combat, reliability, a machine for a broad circle of ordinary pilots, and not only for a handful of born aces. And what is most striking, the aircraft honestly fulfilled this task. The Focke-Wulf 190 truly was noticeably simpler and friendlier to handle than the nervous, exacting Messerschmitt 109. A wide, stable landing gear track, a single engine control lever instead of a dozen, a splendid view from the teardrop canopy. All these clever, hard-won engineering solutions honestly reduced the load on the pilot. They gave him more free seconds, more attention to focus on the main thing, on the fight, and not on fiddling with levers. Tank did everything in a designer's power to help the man in the cockpit survive and win. But even the most caring, most pilot-friendly machine is not able to replace years of real combat experience. It lowers the price of a mistake, but it does not cancel the mistake itself. But while these battles raged, both in the West and in the East, inside the Focke-Wulf 190 itself, a problem of an entirely different kind was ripening. A problem that no pilot, not even the most brilliant in the world, could solve. Because it sat not in the cockpit, not in the flyer's hands, and not in his experience. It sat deeper. It sat under the cowling, in the very heart of the machine, in its engine. Picture a strong, trained boxer, sharp, powerful, with a killing punch. In his own ring, at the familiar altitude above sea level, he crushes any opponent round after round. He is feared. He is respected. But there is one single condition under which this giant suddenly weakens and breathes heavily. Altitude. The thin mountain air, where every breath comes hard, where there is not enough oxygen. Up there, on high, he is no longer that unbreakable champion. Up there, he is simply a large man gasping for air. At low and medium altitudes, roughly up to 5,000 or 6,000 meters, this engine was magnificent. Powerful, reliable, full of pulling torque, with an enormous reserve. It was precisely there that the Focke-Wulf 190 felt itself the absolute master and dictated the fight on its own terms. But the moment the machine climbed above 6,000 meters, the picture changed before one's eyes. The air up there grew thin. The engine plainly lacked the oxygen for normal, full combustion of the fuel in its cylinders. The power began to drop. And with it, inexorably, melted away the speed, the rate of climb, the maneuverability. Everything that in the lower layers made this machine a deadly hunter, at high altitude, dissolved literally before one's eyes. The menacing predator turned into a clumsy, gasping target. And the most bitter thing is that this flaw was known from the very start, right from the drafting board. Radial air-cooled engines in those years were in principle, by their very nature, inferior to inline liquid-cooled engines precisely in high-altitude characteristics. Tank knew this perfectly well. He consciously made that sacrifice. He placed a calculated bet on the other low-altitude trumps of his machine. And at first, in the early years, that bet paid off brilliantly. By 1943, a new and terrible enemy appeared in the sky over Western Europe. The American heavy bombers, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. Enormous armadas, bristling with machine guns, and they flew at altitudes from 7,000 to 9,000 meters, that is, exactly there, in that very cold height, where the Focke-Wulf 190 was unforgivably weak. Intercepting these fortresses was a hellishly difficult task. One had to claw one's way up to their altitude at the limit of the engine's strength. One had to catch up. One had to take a convenient position for the attack. And through all of this, one had to keep at least some reserve of power for maneuvering under dense defensive fire. The machine, gasping at altitude, managed this with its last strength at the edge of the possible. At the same time, new versions of the Spitfire, specially honed for altitude, were entering service in the Royal Air Force. And it was they who, at 7,000 to 9,000 meters, felt themselves in their native element, lightly and confidently. The problem had to be solved, and solved urgently. The Focke-Wulf engineers rushed to find a way out of the high-altitude trap. The first attempts were logical, to improve the Bayerische Motorenwerke 801 engine itself. They refined the supercharger, that very device which, under pressure, forces air into the engine and at least somewhat compensates for the thinness of the atmosphere up high. They tried various injection systems, piled modification upon modification. The characteristics rose, little by little, but they rose not enough to break the situation at its root. In parallel ran far bolder, almost desperate experiments. Under the wing they tried to hang additional engines, rocket boosters for a lunge to altitude. The idea looked daring and elegant on paper, but in practice it merely added extra weight to the machine, extra complexity, and sharply lowered its reliability. It was a dead end, not the right solution. And then Kurt Tank took a step that for him personally was almost a capitulation. In 1944, an entirely different engine was fitted to the Focke-Wulf 190, an inline liquid-cooled one, the Junkers Jumo 213A, with a power of 1,750 horsepower. The very type of engine that Tank had so demonstratively, almost defiantly, refused back in the distant year of 37, placing his bet on the star. The circle had closed. History had returned to its beginning. The new version of the machine received the designation Focke-Wulf 190D. The pilots fondly nicknamed it the Dora, and for the distinctive long drawn-out nose that the new inline engine gave it, they also unofficially called it the Long Nose. The silhouette of the aircraft changed beyond recognition. Instead of the rounded, blunt, wide cowling, there appeared a sharp, predatory, elongated nose, very similar, by the irony of fate, to the nose of its old rival, the Messerschmitt 109. And the most remarkable thing, the Dora came out a superb machine. Its high-altitude characteristics, that very Achilles heel, improved strikingly. Its speed grew noticeably. The pilots who had the chance to fly both versions spoke of the Dora with great unfeigned respect, but there was one problem, one yet a fatal one. The Dora began reaching combat units in September of 1944, and the confrontation was already rolling inexorably toward its finale. Germany's production capacity worked under a hail of unceasing bombing. Fuel was in sharp shortage, experienced pilots were in even sharper shortage, spare parts were missing altogether. The outstanding aircraft appeared exactly when there was almost no one left to fly it at full strength, and almost nothing to fly it on. And through all of this, even the brilliant Dora did not solve the main root question, because the main question lay not at all in the plane of altitude or speed. The main question was something else. By the middle of that war, the Focke-Wulf 190 had begun to grow unstoppably, to grow heavier, to accumulate ever new tasks and ever new equipment. Fighter, fighter-bomber, ground attack plane for work over the earth, high-altitude interceptor. Each new role demanded its own solutions, its own assemblies, its own kilograms. A machine in the course of its development inevitably grows heavier, and from this law there is no escape. New, more powerful armament, that is plus several dozen kilograms. Additional armor for the ground attack role, another plus. New radio equipment in the cockpit, another. Reinforced fittings for hanging bombs, more and more. Each new combat task heaped upon the aircraft added dead weight to it. And this growing, choking weight could be compensated in exactly one way, by fitting an ever more powerful engine, an engine that would pull the heavier machine up to the needed altitude at the needed speed. And it was precisely this that did not exist. And so each successive, ever heavier modification of the Focke-Wulf 190 became not a step forward toward new capabilities, but merely one more step toward the dead ceiling. Kurt Tank himself understood this dead end better than anyone else on Earth, and he did not fold his hands. In his design bureau, work was already underway on fundamentally new machines. The chief of them became the Ta-152, a high-altitude fighter with an inline Junkers Jumo 213E engine and an enlarged, sweeping wing, specially honed for the thin air of great heights. By its characteristics, it was an outstanding, almost fantastical machine. By calculation, at an altitude of 12,000 meters, it reached 760 kilometers per hour. This was already the very boundary, the very fine line between the age of piston aviation and the oncoming era of jet aircraft. Note one telling detail in the very name. The first two letters in the designation of this machine are no longer F-W, as on all the earlier Focke-Wulfs. Now it is TA, Tank. This was a personal, almost unprecedented tribute to the designer himself. The aircraft received his initials in its name, his signature, struck into metal and into history. A few dozen Ta-152 managed to reach combat units at the very start of 1945. By the recollections of those few pilots who got to fly them, at high altitudes this machine had no equal among all the piston aircraft of that time. But a few dozen machines is not the figure capable of turning the course of history. This is no longer a weapon. This is an epilogue, a beautiful, sorrowful full stop at the end of a long sentence. And now, about what remained after all this drama. The Focke-Wulf 190, over its years of production, was built in a quantity of about 20,000 machines of all modifications. This is a colossal cyclopean figure. To grasp the scale, it is roughly as many as the number of the famous American heavy fighters, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, built over the entire war. Tank's machine fought on all the fronts without exception where the Luftwaffe was present. It carried on its back tasks for which no one had ever thought to design it, and it managed them. The versatility of its airframe proved genuine, demonstrated not on paper, but in the real sky, under real fire. And now ask yourself that very question over which historians of aviation agonize to this day. And what if? What if the Bavarian Motor Works or Junkers had managed to create that very reliable, refined engine with a power of 2,500 horsepower just 2 or 3 years earlier? Say, not at the end of the war, but already by 1942, and it is by no means the idle question of a dreamer. The airframe of the Focke-Wulf 190 had, from the very start, an enormous reserve of strength precisely for such a powerful engine. The very design allowed for it. It was built into it. Kurt Tank deliberately invested in the machine this colossal potential for growth from the very first drawing, precisely because, like a seer, he understood in advance the aircraft would grow and grow heavier. With such an engine, had it appeared in time, the Focke-Wulf 190 would have closed, at a single stroke, both of its main misfortunes: the cursed high-altitude weakness and the problem of growing weight. There would then have been no need for the Dora with its inline engine as a forced, desperate measure. There would have been no need for the long years of feverish experiments and endless interim modifications. But the engine was not there. It simply did not exist at the needed moment, and so each successive version of the machine was not a lunge forward, but merely one more doomed step toward the invisible ceiling. History knows no subjunctive mood, that is true, but sometimes it allows us to see clearly just how fine, how almost weightless, is the line between what could have happened and what actually happened. The Focke-Wulf 190 was an outstanding platform, perhaps the best platform for a piston fighter that German aviation produced over that entire war, more versatile than the Messerschmitt 109, more reliable, simpler and friendlier to master for the ordinary, average pilot. But an outstanding platform without an engine to suit it is all the same as a brilliant, perfectly tuned racing car under whose hood they have placed an engine from an ordinary truck. Sometimes it goes very fast, astonishing over particular stretches, but it does not come to the finish first. Never. Kurt Tank gave his answer to that long-ago question of the 37 competition. He created that very workhorse on which average, ordinary pilots showed above-average results. The task set before him, he fulfilled fully and with honor. But further on, it was the system that failed. The industry failed, gasping under the bombs. Time itself failed, demanding everything at once and giving not a single chance to calmly bring even one solution to completion. And now, when we have taken this machine apart, literally bone by bone, from the engine to the cockpit canopy, from the gray sky over the Channel to the dusty airfields of the Eastern Front, one last question remains. No longer technical, not historical, personal. What became of the man himself, the creator of this legend? Kurt Tank survived that terrible confrontation. After its end, he left the ruined Germany. First, for distant Argentina, where he designed jet fighters for the local air force. Then, for India, where he worked on his own jet aircraft, the Hindustan HJT-16 Kiran. And then, after all, he returned to his homeland, again to the Focke-Wulf Company. And again he drew, again he created aircraft. He left this world in 1983 at the age of 84. To his last breath he remained an engineer. To his last breath, a pilot. A man who did not merely build machines, but lifted them into the sky himself. A man who knew on his own skin the difference between a beautiful drawing on paper and the real, dangerous sky. On him, on his machine, on what came of it all in the end, and what never did. The Focke-Wulf 190 is often called the best fighter of the Luftwaffe, and that is fair, but with reservations. The best platform? Yes, beyond doubt. The most versatile aircraft? Yes. But also the machine with the greatest, never unlocked potential? Yes, too. And that word, unlocked, is the main, heavy key to this whole drama. Because the history of this aircraft is by no means a history of loud triumph, nor a history of shameful failure. It is a piercing story of how an outstanding design, ahead of its time, collides head-on with harsh reality. with a shortage of resources, with decisions made in warm offices far from the dirty, gun-swept airfields, with a war on two fronts that devoured men and machines far faster than the exhausted industry managed to replace them all. Tank did his part of the work, did it honestly and to the end. He gave the machine everything a designer could possibly give it: a wide, stable landing gear, a splendid teardrop canopy, a single engine control lever, reliable armoring, crushing armament, simplicity of servicing on a dirty field airstrip. He thought constantly about that young, inexperienced pilot in the cockpit, about how to reduce his load and give him an extra chance to survive and win, and believe me, that is worth a great deal. Far from every designer thinks at all about the living man in the cockpit. Very many think only of the pretty figures in the final table of characteristics. But the system failed. The engine failed. The distribution of scarce resources failed. And time itself failed. And it is in this, precisely, that the most important, most universal lesson lies, the one this story brings us. A lesson not only about aviation, a lesson about any great undertaking where living human talent collides head-on with a cumbersome system. An outstanding result demands not only the outstanding design of a single genius, it demands the coincidence of a multitude of things at once, the right instrument at the right time, the right people in the right places, resources in the right quantity and at exactly the moment they are needed. When all of this coincides at a single point, a legend is born, a triumph is born. And when it does not coincide, an entirely different story is born. A story of what something beautiful could have become, but never did. The Focke-Wulf 190 is a story precisely of the second kind, and believe me, it is not one whit less valuable than any story of loud triumph, because it is precisely such stories, bitter and honest, that answer the main question most truthfully of all: how this world is actually arranged. Today, a few surviving Focke-Wulf 190 stand quietly in museums, in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, in the Royal Air Force Museum in London, in various other points of the world where people still come to simply stand and look at this machine, to look at its wide, squat landing gear, at the round nose with that very characteristic fan behind the propeller spinner, at the teardrop canopy that the whole world later copied. And if you ever find yourself beside such a machine, stop for a minute. Do not walk past. Look at it closely. Before you is an aircraft that in one thing was years ahead of its time, and in another hopelessly behind it. That was the terror of the skies in the hands of some, and an ordinary target in the hands of others. That could have become far more than it became, and all the same left a mark in history deeper than many machines that were far luckier. This, precisely, is its true story. Not simple, ambiguous, real. Thank you for watching it through with me to the very end. And before you close this video, one short moment. If this breakdown made you look at the Focke-Wulf 190 in a new way, support the channel. Hit the like button. It is the best signal that detailed stories like this are worth making further. Subscribe if you are not yet with us, and be sure to tap the bell. Only that way will you not miss the next episodes, and ahead of you wait more than a few sealed pages of military aviation. Write in the comments which machine or which designer to break down next. I read everything. Until we meet again in the sky.